My name is Trevor, and I'm a freshman in college. I don't have a lot of bills to pay, as I'm lucky to have a supportive family. However, I still have to pay for my own food and for whatever random activities I want to do with my friends. I do Uber Eats every once in a while just to make enough to afford these things. I drive an old beater Honda Accord that probably belongs in the scrapyard, but it does the job, I guess. Anyway, I had been delivering for a couple of hours on this particular day, and it was about 10 p.m. when I picked up an order from Wendy's. There was nothing abnormal about it, at least from what I knew. I drove 15 minutes down the mostly empty highway. The turn was directly off the highway onto some gravel road. It was in a forest, and without any streetlights, it was very dark. The headlights on my Honda were really dim too, which made it difficult to drive down this road. All I could see was about 10 feet ahead. After a minute, the road stopped very suddenly. I checked my Uber Eats app, and it showed that I'd arrived. However, I didn't see a house anywhere. I stepped out of my car and took a few steps in front of my headlights, trying to see if there was a path or something. I didn't see anything, it was just woods and trees. I started to wonder if maybe I had missed a turn somewhere along the gravel road. I turned back around and opened my car door, but as I was getting in, I spotted a light in the woods. It was just a small, dim light coming from between the trees. It wasn't moving at all, which made me think it might be a porch light. I walked a little bit closer to try and see, but it wasn't bright enough to show anything around it. Literally, all I could see was the light itself. I stood there for a minute, awkwardly holding the Wendy's bag, unsure whether or not to walk up to it. Then it suddenly moved. It went behind one of the trees and either turned off or just stayed behind it because it never showed back up. I was definitely unnerved. Like, if this was the guy who ordered it, then what was he doing? I took a few steps back toward my car, and that's when I heard leaves crunching from directly in front of me. I could hear it getting closer, but still saw nothing aside from empty darkness among the trees. I dropped the bag and got in my car. It took my stupid old car way too long to start, but when it finally did, I made a 3-point turn and began driving back down the gravel road. As I did, I caught a glimpse of a man in the side of my headlights, sprinting through the woods and right at the road, clearly trying to cut me off. I luckily made it past him before he got in front of me because, honestly, I don't think my car would have been able to stop or swerve out of the way. The rest of that gravel road was eerily quiet. When I got back to the highway, I ended my shift and went straight back home. I looked up that area on Google Maps, and there were absolutely 0 houses there. It was just some abandoned gravel road with a dead end. I don't know what I was in the middle of or how many people were in the woods around me, but I know I'm lucky to have gotten away. I'm a maintenance worker for a small business. They run all their operations during the day, so I work overnight. It makes my job easier because I don't have to work around them, and vice versa. It's technically just a part-time job, though I work from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. on weekdays. This night, I arrived a little late but clocked in right away and got to work. An hour went by, and as I was cleaning off one of the desks, the phone at the front of the building started ringing. Obviously, the place was closed, and I didn't have any business answering it, so I let it ring through. But a couple of minutes later, it rang again, and then again, and again. I knew it wasn't my boss or anyone else who worked here because they would have just texted or called me directly on my cell phone. It wasn't like they were calling right after the place closed either. The service had stopped at 6 p.m., and it was around 9 p.m. now. After the 5th time it rang, I walked up to the front desk and looked at the caller ID. It just said, "Unknown caller." I tried to decide whether to just mute the phone and leave it or to quickly answer and let them know we were closed. Ultimately, I didn't want to deal with it, so I just decided to mute it. I walked away from the front and continued with cleaning off the desks. Probably 30 minutes went by, and I had totally forgotten about the phone. I kind of assumed that by now they had to have given up anyway. It was about 10 p.m., and I was upstairs taking a break in the small coffee room when I heard a sound from below me. It was a beep, a single electronic beep that I'd never heard before. I didn't think much of it at first until I heard a door open and close. I literally turned my head toward the stairwell and just looked, completely stunned for a moment. Who could possibly be coming into the building right now? It was way too late. I was a little nervous, but really hoped that it was just a worker who had forgotten something. I walked up to the open stairwell and listened for a second before calling out. "Hello? Is someone down there?" I heard subtle footsteps abruptly stop as soon as I called out. There was a pause. "Hello," I said again, my body slowly filling with tension as I started to worry about the possible other scenarios. Then, I heard a couple more footsteps getting closer to the bottom of the stairwell. I quietly leaned over and looked down at the doorway. There was a shadow of a man standing still, probably just a foot or two from the entrance to the stairwell. It looked like he was waiting for me or something. After a really unnerving few seconds, I backed away and moved further into the coffee room, then quietly pulled out my phone and called 911. I just hid behind the bar table and whispered to the operator as I stared at the empty stairwell. It only took a couple of minutes for the first officer to arrive. I heard him come in and yell for everyone to come out. I didn't hear anyone else say anything, and he made it all the way upstairs without seeing anyone. We didn't get any answers until we got a hold of the security tapes. Disturbingly, the guy stood at the bottom of that stairwell for several minutes, holding a knife and looking absolutely unfazed by anything. He didn't seem to have come in with the intention of hurting me. Actually, it seemed like he had no idea I was there until I called out. However, once he knew I was there, it looked like he was 100% willing to harm me if I came in his way. After a couple of minutes and just before the officer arrived, he left out the front door. I guess the biggest mystery is how he got a key card to unlock the door. That's what the beep sound was. Even I didn't have a key card. I just had a normal metal key. The search is still open for the guy, and I still work there. Hopefully, this was just a one-time thing, but it definitely still has me feeling uneasy some nights. During a period of my life when I was mostly living on the road, I often made money through house sitting and dog sitting. It was super easy and convenient to get temporary jobs that way, and it also paid me to stay at some really nice houses for several days or even weeks. I was scheduled to dog and house sit at a place in Washington this week. I drove up there on a Thursday and met the owners and their dog, a large golden retriever named Apple. She was extremely friendly and loving right from the start. Only an hour after I arrived, the owners left for their vacation. With them gone, I decided to explore the house a bit just to make myself more comfortable, as I was going to be there for 5 to 6 days. It was a really large home in a very remote area of the national forest. I mean, this place had to be worth at least $1 million, and it honestly felt surreal to be staying there. That first day, I played with Apple, got used to the home, ate dinner, and then took her out for a walk around 7 p.m. The sun was slowly setting, and the whole road I was walking along was a peaceful, wooded area. There were no other houses visible in any direction. I brought Apple down the road for about 15 minutes, then turned around and headed back. As we got back to the driveway, though, I saw a guy walking down it. As he passed by me, he kept his head down and didn't say anything. He looked like he was in his 30s with short black hair and some baggy jeans. This was a really long driveway. It took a full 3 minutes of walking just to get to the house, but there were no other houses connected to it. So, where the hell could he be coming from other than the house? I hurried Apple up to the home and got us both inside, locking the doors just in case. The only thing I could think of was that he was exploring the woods or something and just happened to pop out by the driveway. Seeing him walking away, I hoped that whatever it wasn't something to worry too much about. Nothing else happened that day, and I went to bed that night around 10 p.m. The next day, I didn't do much. I relaxed inside with Apple, watched a movie, and ate leftovers from the day before. I felt like staying up late, and the house had this really awesome upstairs balcony with a fire pit. Once the sun set, I lit up a campfire and sat on a lounge chair. Apple stayed with me for a while, but she eventually went back inside to lay in her bed. About 30 minutes passed, and it was maybe 11:30 p.m. when I heard Apple start barking from inside the house. It wasn't just a typical bark. It was very sudden and frantic. Knowing she was such a friendly dog, this really caught me off guard. I jumped up from the chair and ran inside. She was still barking, and it was coming from the other side of the upstairs hallway. When I looked down, I saw that one of the doors to a spare bedroom was open, and I could see Apple in the room with her tail between her legs, staring at one side of the room. I called her name, but she just continued to bark, so I hurried into the room. Her gaze was fixed on a door. I could feel my adrenaline start kicking in as I moved toward it and slowly cracked the door open. It was pitch black in there, and I didn't know where the light switch was, but it was a large walk-in closet full of clothes hanging everywhere. Somehow, my eyes locked on a small gap, and there was an eye staring right back at me. For a moment, I froze before quickly slamming the door. I could hear the clothes rattling inside the closet as I grabbed Apple's collar and rushed her downstairs and straight into my car. I drove away, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and called 911. Once the cops arrived, I waited anxiously for 10 minutes as they searched the home but came out alone. The guy had already left. We went over everything, and I told them about the person I saw yesterday, but that was all I knew. I really couldn't confirm if it was the same person. What the officers told me is that the man probably knew the family was going on vacation and thought the house would be empty. What he intended to do is unclear, though, and honestly, I'm not convinced he broke in and hid in the closet without knowing I was there. I think he knew, which only makes it more terrifying. Thankfully, Apple noticed him and got my attention because, without her, I don't know what would have happened that night. I work at a small retail store. It shouldn't be any surprise to hear that I hate it there. The work, the customers, even some of the coworkers. But it's my first job, and really, the only one I was able to get with no experience. Over winter break, my school was out for 3 weeks, which meant I wasn't forced to only work closing shifts. I talked to my manager, who said I could take up a few overnight shifts if I wanted. I gladly accepted, knowing I wouldn't have to deal with customers and could mostly work at my own pace. I knew the overnight manager, Chris, and when I came in for my first overnight, he showed me what to get done and left me to it. It was just the two of us working on opposite ends of the store. Being overnight, it was really nice getting to work in peace and even listening to music as I went. But it only took a couple of hours for the fun of it to wear off. I was actually getting really bored and even a little sleepy from not talking to a single person. It was just past 1 a.m., so I let Chris know I was going to take my 15. I grabbed my lunch from the fridge in the break room, then left the building and sat in my car. I scarfed down my food, hoping to have 10 minutes for a quick nap. But before I rested my eyes, I noticed someone standing next to the building. The entire parking lot was empty and dark, with only the lights from inside the retail store on, so there was no reason for anyone to be there. The guy was looking into the windows, like he was trying to see inside. It was so odd that I felt like I had to stay awake to watch him. He looked like a pretty tall dude with short hair, wearing a dark leather jacket and some old boots. I watched him for the rest of my break, So a whole 10 minutes, and the guy just stood outside, peering into the windows of our store. Having to clock back in, I got out of my car and started walking toward the front doors. I was walking fast, hoping to slip by without the guy having a chance to stop me. But before I even got halfway through the parking lot, he spun around and looked at me. His eyes were dead and sleepless, and he had a blank expression. I kept walking, trying to make it to the door, but the guy immediately started walking over to me. He was maybe 10 feet away as I came up to the door and started unlocking it. He called out to me, but I hurried inside and locked it behind me. I just ignored him out of a gut feeling that he was up to no good. Maybe it was harsh of me not to at least see what he wanted, but at the time I had a really bad feeling about him. I made my way to the back to use the bathroom, then was back on the sales floor a few minutes later. I wanted to get back to work, but I felt tempted to check the front windows to see if the guy was still creeping around out there. So I walked up to the front, expecting to see his creepy eyes staring through the window, but he wasn't there, not even anywhere in the parking lot. I figured he had left for good, so I went back to the aisle I was working in. Another few minutes went by. It was probably 1:30 by now, when suddenly the alarm sounded throughout the building. I knew exactly what it was right away. It was the back door in the storage area of the building. Sometimes the managers would toss stuff in the dumpster out back and accidentally trip the alarm, but with only Chris working, it seemed really unlikely. I started making my way to the back of the store, but the closer I got to the doors to the storage room, the more the bad feeling crept up inside me. If it was Chris, surely he would have shut off the alarm by now. When I got to the back, just before I entered, I heard a bunch of thuds coming from the other side. I quickly pushed open the door, and the sound stopped. Down the large hallway, I could see the back door wide open, but there was no sign of Chris anywhere. "Chris," I called out. He didn't respond. Instead, a moment later, a head peered around the corner on the other end of the hallway. I recognized that man's creepy, dead look right away and felt my whole body tense up. After hesitating, I went right back the way I came, not stopping for anything until I got outside and into my car. I called 911, and it was as I did that I realized I still had no idea where Chris was. The cops arrived quickly, running into the building and searching the whole place. Thankfully, they found Chris unharmed. He had locked himself in the manager's office after the guy broke in and chased him. Chris also explained the thud noises I had heard, saying the man was pounding on the office door and trying to break it down. The guy ran away as soon as I did, so he was gone before the cops could get to him. We have a blurry image of his face from the security cameras printed out and hung up on the back wall so other employees can keep a lookout for him. As far as we know, he hasn't come back, and there's no saying what he was trying to do that night. I'm just lucky that my gut feeling was working well that night. This happened a few years ago. At the time, I was hopping between jobs, struggling to find something that paid well enough for me to live on. I eventually found myself working as a security guard for a large warehouse. When they hired me, it was pretty clear they'd never had a security guard before. They basically told me I just needed to walk the perimeter and make sure nobody broke in or stole anything. A few days after getting hired, I found out from one of the employees that there had been a couple of break-ins overnight recently, which was the whole reason for hiring me. I probably should have been more worried than I was, but honestly, I thought it was just because nobody was in the building overnight. I figured now that I was there, hopefully it wouldn't be an issue. The first 2 months were fine, nothing happened at all. I never saw anyone come near the building on the cameras or had any encounters. Considering the pay and the lack of work I had to do, it was the easiest money of my life. Then, on a typical night, I came in at 11 p.m., made sure all the employees and staff had left, and went around to lock the place up. I then went to the security office, double-checked that the cameras were working properly, and that there were no alerts. But I quickly noticed a flag on one of the doors, which meant it wasn't shut or locked properly. This confused me because I had just gone around and locked all the doors. I got up and walked through the warehouse to the other side, where the supposedly unlocked door was. It was still closed, and the bolt looked like it was in, but after a couple of tries, it swung right open. I was really confused at this point. I looked outside just in case, but the whole area around the warehouse was empty fields. As far as I could see, there was nobody out there. I then turned my attention to the door. I tested the bolt and it seemed to be okay, but the door would still open after a few tries. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a small piece of wood sitting inside the hole where the bolt slid into. The way it was stuck in there made it obvious that someone had put it there on purpose to keep the bolt from fully shutting. Having been on duty the night before and not seeing any alerts, this had to have been done recently. I pulled the piece of wood out and made sure the door was securely locked this time, then started making my way back to the security office to check the cameras. I wasn't sure if an employee had done it earlier in the day for some reason or if it was someone else. But as I was walking back, an uneasy feeling came over me, and I thought back to the break-ins I was warned about. The whole warehouse was quiet and dark, with only the dim energy-saving lights on, which didn't help me feel any better. As I rounded the corner, just about to reach the office, I saw something move by one of the storage racks. I could barely see anything, but I made out the shape of what I think was someone's head peeking around one of the boxes. I quickly started walking again, trying to pretend like I didn't see them. I made it into the office, locked the door shut, and immediately used the phone to call the police. My voice was shaky. I was completely terrified. I then put the phone down and logged back into the security system. I looked through each of the live feeds until I got to the one showing the hallway I was in. I almost physically jumped from my seat when I saw the footage. There was a man standing right on the other side of the door. The view from the camera was far away, but there was no mistaking that he was holding a weapon in his hand. It looked like maybe a large knife or even a small gun. I sat there in fear, panicking the entire time I waited, thinking that this guy might shoot the lock off the door or something. After a few minutes, though, he backed away. I followed him on the cameras as he went to the other side of the warehouse and exited through the door I had just repaired. He then ran off into the fields behind the warehouse. The company and the police worked together to conduct an investigation, but nothing ever came of it. Of course, I quit not too long after that and moved on to a much less stressful job. To this day, I don't know why that man broke in or what he wanted. For several years, I've worked at an office building in the center of town. It's an online news and journalism company, and I'm one of the web developers. My job is usually just to make sure all the articles launch on the website properly and to ensure the site runs smoothly and stays up 24/7. Now, we usually had an overnight worker, but he had recently quit, so the company kind of forced me to fill in until they could find someone else. At first, I didn't mind. I mean, how bad could it be? But I learned pretty quickly that it was awful. I was the only one in the building working overnight. I had no one to talk to and really nothing to do. I would just have to sit there by myself in a huge empty office. On this night, I was lucky enough to have a small project to do. It wasn't much, just adding a page to the website, but I kept my mind occupied for an hour. Once I finished it, though, I was back to just sitting and waiting. Eventually, I got up, made a cup of coffee, and decided to take a walk around the building. I had never explored any of the other floors or rooms before, so I was both bored and curious. I stepped into the stairwell and walked up to the top floor. All the lights were off except for the one in the hallway. I walked down and casually looked into a few rooms, but there wasn't anything interesting. so I started walking back to the stairwell. But then a sound came from below me. It was a door squeaking open, or at least it sounded exactly like it. I knew nobody else was in the building with me, so a chill ran through my body. I quickly calmed myself, though, and thought it was probably just a pipe in the walls or the building making some other sound. I walked back down to the third floor and began walking down the hallway toward my room. But something caught my eye. A door to one of the other rooms was open. I don't know why, but I felt like I remembered all the doors being closed. I didn't know if this was my brain playing tricks on me or what, but for some reason, I just knew that door was closed. I walked over to it and looked into the room. It was a large office just like mine, with rows of cubicles in the middle. All the lights were off, so only the thin line of light from the hallway seeped into the room. "Hello? Is someone in there?" I called out, but my voice echoed through the hollow room with no reply. Another chill ran through me, and I closed the door, then went back to my office and sat at my desk. I chugged my coffee and rubbed my eyes, trying to get my head together. I checked the time, and it was a bit past 2 a.m., so I just had a few more hours to get through. I ended up scrolling through my emails and wasted another 10 minutes before I heard it again. That same exact sound, this time noticeably coming from somewhere on my floor. I stood up, my heart racing, and hurried to the door leading into the hallway. I opened it and looked out. That same door across the hallway was now open again. I felt my stomach tighten, and my body went numb. Something was seriously wrong now. I decided there was no better time to leave than right now. I wasn't going to risk looking around again. I stepped into the hallway and started hurrying toward the stairs. As I did, I heard a footstep behind me. I quickly glanced back. There was a woman standing in the hallway, not far from the office I had just come from. She looked disheveled, with tangled long dark hair and her eyes wide open, making her look completely insane. I ran for the stairs and continued all the way down to the bottom floor. I heard her footsteps behind mine for a second, but then it sounded like she stopped chasing. I called the police once I felt I was safe. What's crazy is I had eyes on the back door in the main hallway camera. The cameras could see the front door, but when police showed up, they couldn't find her inside the building. None of the doors were unlocked or broken either, so how she got in or out is a mystery. For the next couple of weeks, the company hired an overnight security guard, but I was still terrified every night. I would be constantly looking over my shoulder, thinking that woman could have snuck back inside. And with no other info on her, there's no saying what she was trying to do. I was working late at the office one night. We have a big 2-story building in a business complex, and sometimes, if we have to catch up on work, we end up staying late. I had taken 2 sick days the week before, so I really had to get my project done and didn't have much time left to finish it. I planned to stay a few hours that night and a few more the next night to catch up, leaving anywhere between 1 o'clock and 2 a.m. often. Others would be there late as well, but on this night it was just me. I was working at my desk, which was in the middle of a whole room full of desks. As I typed away on my laptop, I started to get a little drowsy. After fighting it for a bit, I got up to make some coffee in the break room. I started the machine and leaned against the table, barely keeping my eyes open as it slowly poured into the mug. But a sudden thud shook me awake. It sounded like it was downstairs, but it was really loud, resonating through the whole building. Nothing followed the sound though, it was just the one thud. I walked over to the doorway and looked out at the stairs, debating whether or not to see what it was. Honestly, I was so tired I thought it had to just be something falling in one of the rooms downstairs, so I chose not to investigate. I grabbed my mug and went back to my desk, continuing to work. I sat there for another hour, non-stop working, But the coffee really wasn't fixing my sleepiness problem. I kept working though, trying to power through it, but I was only prolonging the inevitable. At some point, I dozed off at my desk. When my eyes opened, I remember being immediately irritated and somewhat dizzy, like I'd been annoyingly woken up from a deep sleep. As I regained my senses, I noticed a sound coming from somewhere in the building. It was a beep sounding every 4 or 5 seconds, but it was very faint. I looked at my laptop, seeing it was nearly 2 a.m. I decided it wasn't worth trying to work anymore, so I packed up my things and brought them with me as I left the room to both check on the beeping and leave afterwards. As I got to the stairwell, the beeping started to make me nervous. I'd never heard it before, and there was something eerie about it. Maybe I was too tired before to fully comprehend it. I walked down the staircase, and now with the beeping much louder, I peered into the long main hallway. At the far end, there was a metal rod laying on the ground right in front of the open entrance door. I felt blood rush from my face, knowing it should be locked up, and realizing the beeping was coming from the building's security system. With nothing but instinct to go on, I ran down to the opposite end of the hallway and out the back door, getting in my car to call for help. Although I was out of the building, what I learned next was far more terrifying. Police pulled in and searched around, not finding anyone or anything. That's when we checked the security cameras. At 11 p.m., a man could be seen walking up and breaking the door open with a single hit from some kind of tool, the very bang sound I had heard while getting coffee. He then quietly moved around the first floor and up to the second, where he came into the office I was in and stood quietly, only a few feet behind me while I was working at my desk. He then went back downstairs, came up again while I was sleeping, and walked around the whole office, even going right up to me and searching around my desk. It's not clear if he stole anything, as there weren't cameras in every room, but there didn't seem to be any obvious answers as to what he was doing there. After seeing the security footage, though, I've never stayed alone at that office again. For the past couple of years, I've had the same job. I'm a janitor for a popular fast food restaurant. I don't take orders or anything at all aside from cleaning. I don't even see other workers a lot of the time because I'm scheduled overnight at the restaurant. Everything needs to be deep cleaned every day, and during open hours, it's basically impossible to do. I'd never had anything happen during my shifts, aside from the occasional customer knocking on the window asking if we're open. So on this night, I came in and got to work like I usually did. A couple of other employees were still there when I got there, but by 10 p.m., which was an hour after closing, it was just me for the rest of the night. I popped in my headphones and started scraping the grills and prepping everything that needed to be hosed down. After a while, I lost track of time, but my best guess is that it was around 12 a.m. when I heard a knock at the front of the building. I pulled off my headphones, hearing it again. I walked to the front, expecting someone at the door wanting to see if we were closed. But when I looked, nobody was there. I went up to the door and looked out at the parking lot. No cars or people. I knew I'd heard it from this side of the building, though, so I waited for it again, but there was nothing. I ended up thinking I just mistook another sound for knocking and went back to work. Another hour or so went by. Then I took a lunch break. I grabbed my lunch bag and sat at one of the tables in the middle of the dining area, taking my time since I was actually ahead on my cleaning. Once I finished eating, I went to the back and turned to grab the mop, only to see a man's face staring at me from outside the drive-through window. He had messy hair and a blank face, but his eyes had something strange about them, like they were empty. I froze up for a second, and after a moment, the man calmly turned and walked away. My heart was racing in my chest, and I just stood in place, listening to his departing footsteps. I didn't know what to think. It was just incredibly creepy and strange. Once I got my confidence back, I opened the window and looked out to make sure he left. It was dark beyond the light of the restaurant, but I didn't see anyone, so I closed it up and locked it. I was on edge for the next hour, constantly looking behind me at the windows, feeling like I was being watched. But as my shift was coming to an end, I started to feel some relief, and the anxiety calmed down. One of the last few things I had to do was roll all the garbage bags out to the dumpster, which I was avoiding as long as I could. I checked the window before I stepped out, and it looked clear, so I quickly opened the door and got the garbage out. I started tossing them one by one into the dumpster, but not even 20 seconds in, the man appeared from around the corner. I stopped what I was doing and quickly asked what he needed. He didn't respond as he walked up to me, still wearing that same empty stare. Now that I could see his whole body, though he was even more terrifying, being a fairly large man and wearing a dirty, stained coat. Not knowing what else to do, I ran for the door. I opened it just as the man's footsteps rushed up behind me, and as I slammed the door shut, the man was able to stick his arm into the gap, preventing it from closing. I turned and sprinted to the other end of the restaurant, getting my keys out and unlocking the front door as fast as I could, while hearing the man closing the distance on me. I barely got away again and ran before he got to me. I sprinted across the parking lot as far as I could, while calling the police. 5 minutes later, the police got to the restaurant, but the man was gone. We got footage on the CCTV, but no identity could be made from it. It also showed that as soon as I ran away, the man just stayed there and watched me for a bit, then left out the back door. What he wanted from me is unknown, but his creepy and objectively horrifying behavior gives me chills even to this day. I work at a gas station in the center of my town. My shifts aren't always the same, but I find myself working overnights and early mornings most of the time. I'd been there for a whole year at this point, and honestly, I didn't have many negative things to say about it. It was just a normal, mid-paying job that only required me to stand in one spot for 8 hours and talk to the occasional customer. On this particular night, I was working an overnight shift, the typical 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Although it's usually not too busy overnight on weekdays, it was worth mentioning that it was raining a decent amount that night, so I was expecting it to be a pretty quiet shift. The first couple of hours, I sat in a chair behind the register and just waited for anyone to come in. I got a few people who paid for gas with cash, but by 12:30 or 1 a.m. it was pretty much dead. No customers came inside, and barely anyone was even getting gas outside. With absolutely no customers, I went around the counter and started fixing up the shelves a bit. They weren't too bad, but it was just a way to keep myself busy. While doing this, I had my back facing the windows, but I noticed headlights glare through the store as someone pulled into the pumping stations. I didn't think much of it, just some guy pulling in to get gas. I kept tidying up the shelves for maybe 10 minutes before I unconsciously glanced out the window. The car was still there by one of the pumps with a man standing next to it. As soon as I looked, the man shifted away, making it obvious that he was looking at me. After seeing that, I felt really weirded out, especially since he had been there supposedly pumping gas for a whole 10 minutes. I went back to the counter and checked out the window again 30 seconds later, seeing the man getting into his car. The headlights flashed a few times like he was trying and failing to turn it on, but eventually he got it running and drove away in a hurry. I stood there and just looked out the window for a minute. Something didn't seem right. I got an idea and pulled up the recent transactions for the pump he was at. The last time it was used was hours ago. He had been there for 10 minutes with no reason at all, other than watching me through the windows. I stayed behind the counter for a while, trying to wait out the rest of my shift. A few more cars came and went, and then it got really quiet again for a while. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. The rain was heavy, but a rhythmic shuffling noise on the ground was barely audible through it. Footsteps right along the side of the building, moving toward the back. I tried to look out the window, but there was no good view. I did notice that no cars were in the parking lot or by the pumps, though. I quickly left the counter and went to the back door, which was a heavy metal door with no windows or anything on it. I pressed my ear against it and listened as the footsteps got louder and louder until they were right on the other side of the door. My eyes moved to the handle, waiting in the silence before the handle turned slowly and slightly but got caught by the lock. It went quiet again. Almost a whole minute passed before a man's voice grunted in frustration, followed by a sudden sharp sound sliding across the other side of the door. Footsteps followed soon after, leaving and moving back to the side of the gas station. I ran back to the front, hoping to see him walking away, but didn't catch sight of him. Acting quickly, I picked up the store phone and dialed 911, hoping they could catch him before he got too far. I didn't know what was really happening, but someone trying to get in through the back door had to have intended something bad. When the cops arrived, they didn't find the man, but what they did find was a car on the side of the road less than a quarter mile away. The same car I'd seen earlier with the man who had been watching me. It had run out of gas and had mismatched license plates. Turns out it was a stolen car from 2 states over. The other thing they found was a long scrape across the back door, likely made by a sharp metal object, probably a knife. Knowing all these details, I think I actually got extremely lucky, as the man was probably already on the run and could have been planning anything. I worked at a retail store in my 20s as an overnight lead. It wasn't one of your regular big chain grocery stores. It was a local place with only about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights, I'd have an overnight stalker to help out, but it wasn't uncommon for me to spend the whole shift alone. Again, it wasn't the biggest store, so it really wasn't a very intense working environment. A lot of the time, I'd find myself working slow just so I wouldn't run out of things to do. This was one of those nights where I was alone and working at a steady pace. At the beginning of my shift, I loaded up some boxes and moved into the aisles to start stocking. It doesn't take much mental effort, so my mind was elsewhere, thinking about random things, not really paying any attention. I went through about 3 aisles until a knock at the front entrance made me jump. I almost didn't even realize what it was because I was so spaced out, but once I did, I got really confused. I heard the knock again, loud enough to echo through the store. I walked down to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front windows, seeing a man in a hood standing at the doors. I went up to the other side. "We're closed. Won't be open until 8 a.m., I said through the glass. The man looked at me but didn't say anything. I pointed at the sign on the door. "We're closed, sorry," I repeated. The man continued to look at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. I watched him walk until I couldn't see him anymore, but it didn't look like he had parked anywhere. The whole thing was odd, to say the least, but I figured he was just at the wrong place or something. I went back to what I was doing, stocking the shelves, and eventually forgot about the man. By 2 a.m., I had gotten through half of the aisles and was ready to take my lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and went to the break room on the other end of the building. I was in there for probably a good half hour before I tossed the rest of my lunch and went back to work. I walked through the store and to the end of the aisle I was working on, but just as I looked up, there was a man walking past the other end. He looked like he was just walking across the store, not having noticed me. I froze in place, feeling that instant rush of fear. Now listening intently, I could hear the man's footsteps moving toward the side of the building I'd just come from. So, I moved into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they went toward the break room. But just before I left the aisle to try and run for help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. The footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I ran for the other end of the aisle, looking back and seeing the man turn in and start running at me. I ran for the front door, getting my keys out and trying to unlock it with shaky hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I got it open, and just as I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash in the corner of my eye and heard a pop sound that made my ears ring. A gunshot. It was so loud I didn't even know where it landed, but I sprinted for my life around the building. I made it to my car and hid in the back seat as I called 911. From what I know, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time police arrived at the store, but they found the back door to be busted open, along with some heavy tools sitting next to it. The most terrifying of their findings was the hole created by the gunshot, sitting right to the side of the front doors. Why the man broke in and was so aggressive, targeting me like that, is unknown. From his behavior, the police seemed to think it was some kind of mental breakdown or psychotic break, not having any real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but I can tell you that for the years following that incident, I was on edge every single night.